So it's my pleasure to welcome Jess Mitchell here to help us tie together the research practices and ideas we've been exploring together, hopefully which will culminate in a commitment to action. Jess Mitchell is Senior Manager, Research Plus Design at the Inclusive Design Research Center at OCAD University in Toronto, which is a meaningless title, it says here, that tells you virtually nothing about her. Here's what you need to know. Jess is often a misfit, values a critical perspective, and appreciates the messy parts of human interaction. Jess has a background in ethics, a fondness for things in threes, and an ability to turn away from messy spaces. Sounds really nifty. So without further ado, it is a pleasure to welcome Jess Mitchell, and it's all yours, Jess. Go for it.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us here. I know it's late in the day for those of us who've been along for the ride since this morning here. It's might be time where you're getting kids ready for bed. You might be getting breakfast ready for yourself, depending on what time zone you're in. I want to do things a little bit differently, perhaps, right now. I think I want to not show you any slides. I think that that's what I'm going to do. So can everybody hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Great. Thanks, Fatima. So it's 5:22 for me right now. It's 11:22 p.m. in Zimbabwe. And I want to start with an email that I got March 16th, 2020 at 2:53 a.m. I'm writing to you today about my concern about the coronavirus. The dilemma I'm having at this time is that I'd like to go home to be with my family in Zimbabwe during this time. In order for me to travel there, I have to go through 2 airports. Those will be Frankfurt or Dubai in South Africa. The South African government has passed a couple of laws about travel, and they're closing the border on Wednesday, the 18th. Although I'll be in transit, they're considering closing the airport, so this will affect travelers who are in transit. So my parents are panicking and are making arrangements for me to go back home on Tuesday, the 17th. That's the next day. This is an extremely stressful and hard time for me and my family, and I'm a little confused on what I'm going to do about my studies. Zimbabwe has a time difference of 6 hours with Canada, and I'm worried this might cause problems for me when it comes to meeting deadlines and exam times. Please, may you assist me with this issue as best you can. Honestly, I wish I could stay here, but they're worried if I get the virus, I won't have any family to support me. And I feel the same way, as I would like to be with my family if anything happens. I'm worried and scared if I don't take action soon, I'll be stuck in Canada all by myself. Later that morning at 7:57 a.m., I got another email. With regard to my previous email, please have a look at the attachment my dad sent me. I'll be leaving tomorrow to go home because if I don't, I won't be able to get into the country. His dad had sent him a text message that said, come home now. March 20th, that's 4 days later. I left Toronto early on the 17th, arriving in Frankfurt. I had a long wait, 13 hours, waiting for a connecting flight to Johannesburg. When boarding time approached, the South African Airlines flight to Johannesburg, I was informed I wasn't allowed to travel, even though I was going to be in transit to another location in Zimbabwe. I was required to have a South African passport. Now I was stressed out and panicking, wondering how I was going to get back home. I then found out from a travel agent there was a flight leaving from Frankfurt on the same day that was going to Ethiopia. Then a 3-hour wait in Addis, then the next flight into Zimbabwe. Lufthansa refused to pay for the ticket, so I had to pay a crazy amount in order to get back. Due to the whole switching of flights and using another airline, my bags have been lost, so I have no clothes. Hopefully they'll locate them as soon as possible. The flight back wasn't bad, and I have safely arrived home, where I am in self-isolation, keeping a distance from my family as I've picked up a cough along the way. I hope it's allergies and nothing serious. After traveling for 4 days straight, I'm exhausted but glad to be home. I'll probably need 2 days to recover fully from my journey, then I'll be able to continue with the assigned work. Sam was in a space where he didn't have reliable internet. He was staying in a hut near his family's home, but not with his family, so that he could self-isolate. He said he was getting depressed. It was really starting to have an impact on him. It was finals week, and his institution was requiring him to download some surveillance software for his exams. This was the context that Sam, one of my students, was in. Context matters. So one of the things that we've heard today is that one of the most important things that you can do is understand your students' contexts and understand how to be open, how to be flexible, and how to reflect on how it's having an impact on people. I hadn't gotten these kinds of emails from Sam the whole term, but what he was sharing with me in those emails was the anxiety. He was having to make a decision without a lot of clear information, a big adult decision that was going to have a cascading impact. If he didn't leave when he left, he might have gotten stuck. He would have gotten stuck. He didn't know when he would next see his family. He didn't know when he would next see his friends. And he was packing up everything that he had with him overnight. That's quite a context to be in. I don't think any of us had been in that. Today, when people were talking, I was reflecting on some of the things that we somewhat take for granted. And this is sort of the advantage and the disadvantage of having a time slot at the end of the day when so many brilliant people have been talking. One of the things that occurred to me was language. We get language almost by osmosis without applying much learning at all. We get it as children. We learn it as very young children. And so it's very, it's sort of concealed to us how it is that we're learning it. It just happens. And with that, we learn grammar. A number of people have been talking about how they're not judging for grammar or for language anymore. What is it, in other words, that we're bringing into the classroom that we just got by osmosis, or that we just acquired because of the family that we grew up in, the place where we were born? That sort of struck me. Another thing is that we kept hearing the theme of being willing to shift, change, be flexible, do things differently. So what did we learn this last year? Some of the things that I also heard today from Kathy, for example, she was talking about anxiety, grief, stress. She's talking about how things slowed down. They had to. It was impossible to keep the same pace. And that might have been a gift in some ways. Nadia talked about ways to get back to what education is all about. She was saying in this last year we could do things differently and it wouldn't break. Education wouldn't break. We'd still be learning and teaching. A colleague of mine and a co-presenter with me at a conference came to the conference, and I want to set the stage. I came in the middle of my workday. It was about 2 o'clock. For her, it was 9 o'clock at night. She'd spend the entire day working. She was in her kitchen with her mother passing behind her as she was cleaning. She had 2 internet service providers. Who among us has 2 internet service providers? I have 1. Right before this call, I rebooted my router and I rebooted my laptop just to try to make sure that things would work well. She has 2 internet service providers because in Nigeria, one of them will routinely go down. So she has a backup. If you find that one internet service provider is prohibitively expensive, try 2. Try making that a barrier for education. In the in-class dynamics we lost some things and other things stayed with us. So we went on to these platforms that allow us to connect with people. We lost that kind of feedback. Kathy was talking about that, the ums and the wincing and maybe the reaction to something you said, the sort of nonverbal responses you get. I'm staring at a bunch of boxes right now. I see no one else but a little picture of myself. The things that we didn't lose that come in with us are the matrix of domination, issues of race and class, issues of those who are the majority and those who are the minority. This is also this very disembodied space there's maybe a box with our name next to it, maybe a little bit of audio, maybe video, depending on how many of you are in there and who's made the decisions. It seemed like, and I want to say this, and I welcome you to challenge me on this, I wonder if intrinsic learning was closer at hand for students. I heard from some students that they were understanding why they might learn for themselves in a way that they didn't when they were in classes. I also heard from students that they lost movement. They were sitting for hours, not walking between classes, not seeing different things, not having the sun shine on their faces. They'd never lived this way before, and the lack of movement, physical movement, they weren't getting outside. It was having an impact on them. They were online for hours at a time with no break. It was mind-numbing. Other students of mine said that my class was the only synchronous class that they had, and they felt so thankful for it because they hadn't connected with anybody who was a peer that whole year. They were at home with their families, stuck in their room online all day, watching videos that professors had recorded days before and then posted. They felt completely disconnected from people, completely disconnected from learning, and they felt as though the professors had just sort of checked out. There were 40 people in my class, 40 pasts, 40 ancestors, 40 futures, 40 different interpretations and experiences of the matrix of domination, of the haves and the have-nots. There were a couple of things that were really amazing that I hadn't realized, and I'm embarrassed that I hadn't realized it until that class. They were scared to speak in front of 40 other people. They were scared to share their video. I thought for sure these folks are going to want to pop in. I stared at my own face for 3 or 4 classes until in one of her reflections, the student said, "It must be really lonely for you to have your video on and have nobody else up there with you. I'm going to turn my video on next class because I feel some empathy for you." That was really wonderful. Presentations online. If I'm worried about not getting the feedback, it's a no-go for some of them. If they can't get that feedback, it's a huge barrier. So how can we build community in that context? I felt as though online was easier for some students to be generous with each other once they overcame some of the barriers of the interface and the space. They were able to build on each other's ideas. It was like Kathy said, they were slowing down and they were picking up what somebody said before they would have a new idea. There was less of the competition for space and time, though we did bring some of that with us too. Some classes, only the young men would speak, and we'd stop and wonder about that. Some classes, I would have students not speak about something that they had been researching, only to hear in their reflections that they didn't feel comfortable sharing it with everybody else. There were a lot of barriers to overcome. So I did some of what Kathy was talking about. I did that sharing my own vulnerability. I told them about a panic attack I had early in my career when I gave a presentation. They couldn't believe that I was sharing that. I'd failed. Why would I tell them about a failure? Why would I feel okay about that? Some of them in their reflections that week told me it helped them to turn their video on, to feel a little more comfortable sharing their ideas in small group meetings. When they would break into small groups, they would oftentimes turn their audio all on all at once. We would talk about the feminist perspective of the gaze in online learning, and also the voice that they were electing to turn off because there were too many people in the space. They were worried about feedback. There's some really interesting dynamics going on there. Dynamics that people in education have been talking about and writing about, the gaze, for example. Autumn Keynes has been writing about that a good bit. I showed them some feedback I got for something that I wrote online. The feedback was a little tough. It was a little punchy. They couldn't believe that I showed it to them. They thought, why would you show us something that you had screwed up and somebody pointed to? And we talked about the back and forth that I had with the person who had given me the feedback. When I thanked them for their feedback and said they were absolutely right, they then wrote another note, it's still online, It said, thanks for being so willing to take critique. I make these mistakes too. We all do. And you were a good sport about it. It was an opportunity for us to talk about how to productively critique one another and how to do that in a generous way. A critique didn't have to be a bad thing. It also gave us a chance to talk about how to genuinely and authentically apologize. If you're dealing with human beings and you're dealing with the things that human beings carry with them in that backpack, that matrix of domination, those experiences of being haves and have-nots, you're going to have missteps. These students had never had anybody talk to them about how to apologize. That wasn't what the class was about, but it figured into the learning that we were doing. We were focusing on inclusivity. So when we get into that, we have to look at the who. Who historically has been excluded and individually kept out? We have to look at the what. We get at the stuff that we make, the materials, the content. Where does it come from? And how much does it cost? How easy is it to access or download? In the what, we get at the stuff in the when, we get at the core of learning. When does learning happen? When can we see it, do it, create it? Who among us does it? Who among us gives it? In the where, we get at the spaces. The space this happens, the LMS or Zoom or whatever platform you're on. And in the why, we get at the ethics of it all. Why are things the way they are? And does it make sense? Does it advantage some and disadvantage others? And we know the answer to that. And there are histories that explain why. A conference that I was co-presenting with my colleague from Nigeria, they had the burden that this conference had as well. You have to pick a time zone. And when you do that, you will exclude some people. And you have to have a reason for picking it. Inclusive isn't easy. And we learn this when we start to do inclusion and we start to try to put it into our spaces and our learning spaces, our syllabus, our materials. It's often not comfortable to be inclusive. And we culturally avoid discomfort. We try to immediately solve for it, immediately fix it, immediately find a solution for it. Talking earlier about something failing pedagogically. Why are we so scared of it failing? And what does failure mean? Does it mean nobody learned? Isn't it possible, though, that we can learn from those failures? Like the sharing of my failures. My students were shocked. You're not supposed to talk about failures. As a result, one of my students in his final project spent the first few pages talking about how he had started the final project and failed, and why he had failed and what he'd learned from that. And I thought, oh my gosh, this stuff matters. I think we have to begin with self-awareness. We have to ask ourselves, when do we get comfy? So when my students said that they were scared to talk in front of each other, 40 other people, I had to remember there was a time when I was terrified to talk in front of 40 other people. And what does it mean that I'm comfortable doing that now? What kind of power do I bring into a space? What kind of privilege? Ask for whom this is an uncomfy feeling and wonder why. When you're among your people or like-minded folks or in a safe space, is that desirable? Who gets to participate in that and who doesn't? And we heard that from some of the students. Some of the inclusion and inclusion of the students who weren't necessarily in the same geographic space. And I think in understanding ourselves, we have to ask the question, why do we teach? Do you have an answer to that, really? Like, do you really have an answer to that? So I think that we have to understand why we teach. What are our goals? How do we measure success in our teaching? How do we know when it's time to tweak something or try something new? What do we do with failure? Can you tell when a student has learned something? Can you detect a fake? Can you know when someone else knows? And when do we absolve ourselves of tough things like having the strength to get through deep burnout? Why do you teach? Is it because you're hoping to transfer knowledge, maybe? Build skills? Transfer a bunch of facts? To help people think? To help people become more ethical or accountable? To help people learn how to learn and expect that they will do this ever more? To continue learning yourself? All of the above? None of the above? Why do you teach? Before we get to others, I think we need to spend time understanding ourselves. Then when we get to others, I think we can ask the question, who is here? So inclusion is aware of power, of dynamics, cycles of exclusion, privilege, and they're everywhere. That's that backpack of the matrix of domination that we carry into a room with us. So beware of the comfy and wonder who isn't comfy. But I don't mean to suggest that everything's terrible. I just want us to consider that everything's not amazing and that we can make it better. I want us to grant to ourselves what we grant to technology. Why can't we continuously improve? Why do we have to be perfect all the time, but the technology doesn't? Verizon made an entire ad campaign out of "Can you hear me now?" because they knew the audio was such crap. We loved our cell phones. They were so convenient. So when we start to look at the other, one of the things I think we need to do is ask ourselves, what are our assumptions about them? That is, we know something about ourselves. So who is that them? Who is them to you? Do you make assumptions about all learners being visual learners? Are people with PhDs experts? Do all learners use a mouse? Can all learners learn from the same content? Are all learners students? I want to pause for a second because I want to see what you all are saying. Oh, thank you. I think being Aaliyah, I think being human should make us should make us capable of empathy. But I think that curiosity is a nice place to start too, if people can't tap into empathy right away. But stick with that question, and if you want to talk more about it, let's talk about it in a second. Preferences for learning: pace, path, content, delivery method, text, visual, sonification, video. Individual, group, didactic, participatory, motivation, external, internal, positive, negative, positive, then a negative, then another positive, social support, peer, instructor, other, degree of structure required. I have students for whom ungrading causes a lot of anxiety. It doesn't motivate me to change the way that we're doing grading, but it does give me opportunities to try to address that from a different angle. How do we respond when students say I'm struggling with something? Do we undo it because we're terrified that they're not getting what they should out of their experience? Power asymmetries, racial dynamics, mental health considerations, all of these things are there always, regardless of who's in your class. They are there. When people show up in a classroom, I think well, at least for me, I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but I think sometimes you think about them all existing in a common community on campus or near campus in the same rough geographic area. When we switched to online, I had students like Sam, completely different context. Sam felt completely alone. All of a sudden, he went from Ontario to Zimbabwe, and he was isolated, literally. So I wonder, would we recognize learning if we saw it? One of the things that we heard early this morning from one of the keynote speakers from Ottawa was that her mother taught her, but never used content and never used assessments, tests, grades. So would we know what learning looked like if we saw it? Are we sure? The who are we teaching is important. Do we know? Like, were our students refugees at some point in their lives? I had a student who was a refugee. I didn't learn that until week 6. Were they ever denied an education? Did they grow up in a war zone? What have been the contexts that they have learned within? Do we know who these people are? Do we treat them like they're adults, or do we other them? And when we teach, do we design inclusively? The relationship we build with our students is a design decision. That's one of power that almost instantaneously gets established when you start the class. The dynamics of power we either lean upon or upend is a design decision. The way we organize the content of the course is a design decision. The existence of a participation score is a design decision. A late policy is a design decision. The choice of technology is a design decision that somebody is making. And how often do we stop and ask, for whom does this make learning harder and who benefits from this? Or even, who the heck is making the decision? Did any of you decide which technologies you were going to use to teach this term? So what has COVID taught us? I hope we don't go back to the way things were, because I think that we learned a lot about technology and about some of the ways that we teach. All of my classes are recorded. They have text transcripts and audio files. My students said to me, it's so helpful. I'd never had this experience, but I could read through the text and watch the videos again, and I actually do. Many students are really struggling through this pandemic. I had a few mention that this was the only class I'd mentioned before that was synchronous for them. This is the only class where they had recordings of that synchronous class, plus the text transcripts, plus the audio. I had students saying, why aren't the rest of my classes like this? Why don't they just make this the default at the university? They felt energized by the group work and by the breakout rooms. They missed the social interactions. I had a student drop out of school entirely mid-semester, and he knew I wasn't just going to accept I've dropped out, bye. And he asked if he could still come to class each week. He described how he'd found his passion outside of school. His brother had helped him find what he wanted to do, and he was happier than he'd been in a very long time. His anxiety was very low, but he didn't want to miss out on what he could learn in this course. Of course, he could still come to class, and he did. But what universities make that impossible? What is learning? Who gets to learn? Access. So what COVID has also taught us is it's reinforced some of the inequities, or it's magnified some of the inequities of who gets an education and who gets access, and who is easy for and who it's not easy for. Again, I have one internet service provider. So if you make decisions, you are designing those decisions and they have an impact on others. This has always been the way it is. And if you think of that from that perspective, then you can understand that how we design matters. And every decision is a design decision. So the places that we can apply this thinking to is anywhere that we have an impact on another. Anything you create that another person will interact with, a policy decision. The syllabus is a really good one. Pedagogical approach. Why do you have to have one? Try them all. Assessment, measures of success, and other crimes. Cost, admissions, access, availability, quality, rigor, and other four-letter words. And equivalence. What are equivalents for your students who have disabilities? One of the things that I thought we might do, depending on how much you want to chat, how many of you there are, and how much time we have, is to think about how we could exclude students, all the different ways that we could exclude them, or mandate that they learn in one way and one way only. Once we have that list of things, like no flexibility in the calendar, no flexibility, as Nick was saying, for due dates, then we can flip it and we can say, do we, or does our institution do any of these things, and how do we break through that? So ways that you can do this: worry about getting it wrong, worry about leaving any student out. Think about those design decisions. Think about, were they brilliant or exclusionary? Any decision you make. Can you let the students decide, personalize, and humanize their education? Think about the edges or the outliers. Who's impacted the most? And aim for curiosity, not necessarily solving. Why do we think that solving is the only time that we learn? And I think our work begins now and it never ends, and that we should question everything we do, especially those things that we're doing now and that we'd like to hold on to when we get back in the classroom. So now I hope that we can chit chat about some of this. I need to catch up with you all. We had students, Kathy, also who were taking care of family members, who were caregivers, extended families. Yep. Good point, Alina. Okay. Yeah, Joanne, I love that you're asking that, because that's undercooked. I did a couple of things this term that I hadn't done before. One of the things that I do is I try to look at what I would consider a measure of success for community building, for example. And some of those measures of success are how generous the students are with each other, or how they slow things down. Another measure of success is how long it takes for my queer students to come out to me, or to come out to their peers, and how they do it. That's another measure of how much of a community, and a brave community, a supportive community that we've created. One of the things that I saw from the students this term, because I said to them, in the first 3 weeks, we are going to establish together as a community how we are going to grade. So I did ungrading in the most radical way I've ever done it this term. Before, I've played around with it and done it ish. And I gotta tell you, ish is not as good as doing it. So with the students in the first 3 weeks, we established how grading was going to happen. Some of my students panicked. One of my students resisted. So after week 3, 4, 5, and 6, he was still saying, I have no idea what you want me to do. By week 7, he said, I got it. And I think that I wasted a lot of time getting here, and I feel really bad about that. I'm gonna go back and redo that. As soon as the grading became not an issue, week 4, the output changed dramatically. Almost all of my students started creating better content. I would have them do a weekly reflection. And then we have a baseline at the beginning of the term, and then at the end of the term, they have a reflection on the reflections. So they look back at it. And I had one student say, week 6 was really my favorite reflection, and here's why. And he outlined all the ways it was his favorite. And basically what he created was a rubric for himself. And that's what I asked them to do. Create a measure that you will make week 1 that you can judge yourself against in week 2, and so on. So each week, I want you to reconsider your goals. So I had some students who changed their goals from week to week and say, week 4, I really want to participate more. I feel like I could participate more and be braver in the class. And then week 5, they would come in and they would participate more. And they said, things went really well. I feel like I really succeeded in that. Now I want to push myself and I want to turn my video on. And then they would continue to grow. And then at the end of the term, they would look back on that and they would be able to see their own personal growth. And some of the students reflected quite directly, quite explicitly, Joanne, and said that they had never understood what it felt like to learn for the sake of learning, not to learn to satisfy the requirements or to guess what it was I wanted. They weren't doing it for me anymore. They were doing it for themselves, and they would start to challenge themselves because they wanted to be great at what they were doing. So each week I would pick some of the reflections, some sentences or some thoughts from the reflection, and we would talk about them. And one of my students, I would ask them permission at the beginning of each meeting, I would say, for example, Nick, is it okay if I read from your reflection? Nick would say yes, and then I would read from Nick's reflection, and we would talk about it for a few minutes. One of my students said explicitly in the reflection after I had called out something from his reflection the week after, said, I felt so good that you called out something that I had mentioned in my reflection. I'm so motivated to do that again. I'm so motivated to think about this really hard so that I can come up with a really good question. That felt like intrinsic motivation. He wanted to come up with something so that his peers would hear about it, we would talk about it. Yeah, I guess he was interested in finding something that was interesting to me, but he felt like he had figured out what was going on in the reflections and what it was I was looking for, and he wanted to do more of it because he wanted to be a great designer. I heard from other students that they felt so motivated to make something that they could then carry with them. I encouraged them in the course to do all of their work. It's a course for non-majors. I encouraged them to do all the work with their major in mind. I said, consider building a portfolio. So what is it that they can do with a portfolio? We talked about cameras on and off. There's some research that suggests cameras off is better for groups. So the students got a chance to question everything. I had them early on in the course saying, I get it, like I know I'm supposed to question things, but I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to ask good open-ended questions. And a few weeks later, all of a sudden this person is asking great open-ended questions. They grew. Their minds changed. Some of them in their reflections said, I don't want to go back to thinking the other way, to doing this for the instructors or for the grade. I like this feeling of genuinely learning. That was the students. That had next to nothing to do with me. I just created the guardrails and I gave them feedback. And some of them said, I can't believe you read my reflection and you read it each week. And you give me a little bit of feedback on it each week. I've never had a class like that.
Thank you very much for that response, Jess. I put in the chat that I think as educators, our attention and attentiveness to the community that exists in our class has possibly brought forward those intrinsic motivators. I think it might be a way that we've all grown, is possibly being forced to build community in new ways. And so we all had those skills before, but we were put in a new venue that I wonder if that has caused us to foreground those practices. So I really appreciate your talk and this bringing out that intrinsic motivators piece.
I love the way you just put that, Joanna, and I hope that you write something about that because I think you're spot on. I think something did change and I don't want to lose it. Anybody else?
Yeah, so I have a question. So about ungrading.
Yeah.
In my university, I think it's quite, it's built in the grades, and it's sometimes problematic for teachers to not grade the way it is like usual. So what was your experience? How was the university about your system? Because, for example, in some universities, you cannot just, throw out the grading system. It's kind of hard.
Yeah, so I didn't throw it out, Gabriella, but I would challenge you. I think it is possible to throw it out or do it differently than the typical. The students did get a grade. And I take the Alfie Kohn approach to grading. I avoid grading as long as is humanly possible. Now, the risk I run is that the students will find something at the end of the term that surprises them. I had 40 students this term. I had one student who was surprised. So what I do is this. I ask the students to do self-grading throughout the term, and then at the end, I tell them, we're going to collaborate and decide what your grade is going to be. So I sent each of them an individual email and I said, this is the grade that I'd like to give you. What are your thoughts about this? I had one student who didn't think that the grade that I was thinking of giving her met what her expectations were. So we had a chat about it, and we agreed on something to do to move forward, and we avoided grading as long as possible, and then she got a grade. Absolutely. I think that there are ways to do grading differently. I think somebody else mentioned the idea of giving students feedback. And Kathy mentioned feedback and telling them to work, that we can work on it together. So why is it less rigorous? Like, why is it a fake if we work with the student until they get an A? Why does it matter? What is an A? And I get it. The grading is part of a larger pipeline that we can't necessarily overturn overnight. But if you think about it, I had a student who emailed me after I sent the emails that said, look, this is the grade I think I'd like to give you. And he said, is there any way that I can get it to bump up to an A-? He said, I'm going to make the honor roll if I do. So here's the position where between a 79 and an 80 or whatever it is the difference between him getting on the honor roll or not. These things matter further down the line for him. He might get a scholarship, or he might get some sort of funding, or he might get another opportunity because he was on the honor roll. So I said to him, here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to outline 10 things that you're going to bring into your practice and your discipline. He was a developer, so what are you going to bring into your discipline? And then, you know, we can talk about the grade. He gave me the most thoughtful list of 10 things, and I said, now I want you to promise that every year, professionally, you'll look back at this list and you'll judge your own success in your own work against this. My approach is this: these people are going to be in a workplace very soon. And as a manager, the approach that I take is that no employee review should be a surprise. If there's an area for improvement, you should not learn about it at your employee review. You should know about it all along, because we should have enough of a relationship where I'm giving you feedback throughout. And I take the same approach with the students. There should not be a surprise at the end. And if there is, let's work it out together. One student out of 40, and it took us seconds to resolve the issue. Oh, go ahead.
No, thank you. It's a very insightful answer for me.
I will say that I get pushback sometimes, usually Gabriella, from the sciences or from people who are in the trades. I think there's ungrading there too. Yes, you should grade yes, no. Can somebody, you know, build a bridge that is safe? But can they work with the local community? Can they work on a team? All of those things, that doesn't seem to me to be the sort of thing that we should be grading. If you're writing letters of recommendation for your students, you're not talking about their grades, you're talking about what distinguishes them. So I think that grading has been one of those tools that we use to satisfy the economics of teaching, the scale, the doing less for the same amount, so we can have more students in our classes. That's my radical thought.
I'm curious, Jess, why you, it's Kathy. Hi.
Hi, Kathy.
This has been delightful. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed your talk earlier too.
I'm honored. I'm truly honored. Thank you. And that you even were there and listened. Why are you referring to it as ungrading? They do end up with a grade. Can we come up with a process word or something?
Yeah,
Just curious.
That's a good point. I think use that, Kathy, because there are other people in critical pedagogy who talk about it as ungrading. But I think that ungrading isn't any one thing. I think you're right. There's probably a different term for it. Disruptive grading, something like that. But I do think that there is ungrading where people are doing pass-fail. There's ungrading where people are not getting letter grades. But yeah, my approach was a little bit different. I don't know how the institution responded, to be honest. I didn't ask permission.
Well, I'll work on a term then. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Coin something good. I like collaborative grading, but I don't want it to replace grading, Callie. See, this is the thing. I think somebody asked, how do you introduce ungrading to your students? it's a little bit shocking. They have some of them have a lot of trouble with the notion of ungrading. So I have some students, Nick alluded to this earlier, who are convinced it's a trap. They said, I've had a professor do this before and then I get a grade at the end. And they suggested we weren't going to get a grade, or we were all going to get A's, and we didn't all get A's. So I try to make it not a trap. So what we do first is we deconstruct the power dynamics that happen in teaching, where they've come from historically, and then we decide how we're going to do teaching and learning together. So this is a design class, and so that's relevant to the material that we're learning. We're learning about form and function, about who makes the decisions. For example, we start the course off with who makes the decisions about how many people can be in this class. When it's in a physical space, I'm pretty sure it's somebody like the fire marshal deciding how many people can safely fit into a classroom. Then we talk about how many left-handed desks there are and who's making that, and it's probably somebody in procurement, but it's not me, and it's not somebody in my department. So we talk about all of those things and start to problematize the whole notion of teaching and learning. I wrote about this on Medium. The first semester that I did this, it was that semester Sam was in my class. We were still in person, and the first day of class I sat in the back of the room. There were 2 doors to walk into. I walked in the back and I sat down, and I looked I guess scruffy enough that I could be mistaken for a student. When the clock turned to 7, which was when the class was supposed to start, everybody got really agitated and started talking a little louder because there was some of that sort of titillation of, is the professor going to show up? And so I slowly walked to the front and I stopped and asked a student, I said, is this, this class and this lecture? And she said, yeah. And I said, okay, thanks. And then I walked to the front of the room and I put my backpack on the table and I said, and who am I? And the class went completely silent. And somebody said, you're the professor. And I said, well, how do you know? And so we start to talk about form and function in that context. Like, how am I at the front of the class putting my bag on the table, now the instructor? And what kind of dynamic have we just fallen into and accepted by virtue of that experience? So we break all of that down. We try different pedagogical approaches, and we talk about the power dynamics in them because these are designed, right? So 1 week we'll do Sage on the Stage. I had a student who he really wanted me to give a lecture. I said, fine, I'll give a lecture. I gave a lecture, he didn't show up that week. The other students who were there, we talked about how is the lecture different from when we sit and we have conversations and we discuss these things. And again, intrinsic learning, the students dive in and start to understand the dynamics of what they're doing, not just the content, but the context of what learning is. And this is where Alfie Kohn gets into, if you have a student who knows that they can do a bare minimum of X and get an A-, they'd be crazy or silly to try to get an A. Like, if they know, in other words, how to cheat the system, how to do the bare minimum, this is this dynamic that we've set up with students. Why would they try harder? Why would they do more? If we give them exactly the marching orders and then say march. That's what part of this presentation was. I had this presentation sort of neatly packaged and tied up with a bow on it, but then the whole day happened. Why can't I be responsive to the things that are happening all around me, like Kathy's panel, like the keynote this morning? I want to be able to have a conversation about these things. Yes, Jesse Stommel is a great one. Carol, thank you. I adore Jesse, and I have been inspired by him, by Sean Michael Morris, by Maha Bali, by Bonnie here at Windsor, by Nick, by Robin DeRosa, by so many people. I'm an imposter. They're the real thing.
There's a question here in the chat. I'm not sure if it was addressed, but I'm just going to bring it up just in case. Dr. Gina is asking, can you describe how you introduce ungrading to your students? She's working with an instructor who's experimenting with ungrading.
Yeah, so I think that I started, and then I started going off in another direction. I introduce it the first week. They're worried that it's a trap, and I say in the first 3 weeks, we're going to establish how we're going to do this. I get next to nothing back from them. The first 3 reflections are almost entirely about grading. They can't think about anything else. They want to know, how am I going to know if they did well? How are they going to know if they did well? How are they going to know if they did well compared to the other person in the class? And these are big ethical questions, and these are big topics to talk about. This is a great design experience. And I think that one of the things that happens in that week 4 is they let go of grades. They realize this isn't a trap. It's about building trust. And like I said, my measures of how successful the class is in building a community is when people start to share, hey, this is what's happening in my family, this is what's happening in my life. There's some big transformational moments with these students when you give them a space. Boy, I mean, they're 40 formidable minds. Just set them loose.
I have a question if no one else say anything. So I know we were saying how we want to try and get away from grading and kind of make it more on ensuring that students are actually learning. What would you say to institutions or people who rely on grades to let people into schools, for example, different programs? I mean, even just getting into undergrad, it all relies on your average. So what would you say about that?
Is that a personal question, Fatima?
Just a general question. I just thought, because I mean, everything is so focused on grades. I find it really hard to imagine, one day kind of moving towards no grades. So, what do you think?
I love it. Like, I love that we're hearing your voice because you've spent all day today taking care of all of us. So that's what I meant when I was asking, is this a personal question? So what I do to sort of demonstrate this point is ask the question, which one of the following 5 is least like the others? Here, I can share my screen so you can really digest this one. It's a good one. Can you all see this? Oh, probably not. Can you see this?
Yeah.
Okay, so which one of the 5 is least like the others? Cow, tiger, snake, bear, dog. Now this is a question that I ask at the beginning often of presentations where I'm asking people to consider things like assessment. And the reason I do this is because cow. Thanks, Nick. Because this is a terrible question. This is just downright shitty. This is a question that is on IQ tests for little ones, like 7, 8-year-olds. Based on this, students will be given a kind of grade for their intellect. They will be tracked potentially into different tracks of education, and people will determine what they can or cannot do. And this troubles me an awful lot because this question is ridiculous. You didn't fail, Nick, and everybody didn't fail because you could answer any of these. You could come up with any metric. You could say, is it does it swallow its food whole, or does it chew? Is it a mammal? How many legs does it have? How much fur? What kind of fur? Is it warm or cold-blooded? Does it have venom? Does it lay eggs? Is it lazy? Is it sleepy? Is it fast when it runs? How long does it care for its young? Is it naturally occurring in North America? Does it have 4 chambers in its heart or 3? How many stomachs does it have? Does it eat meat? Which one is the best one to snuggle with? Like, on what level are you asking me to answer this question? And then how are you determining my future for this? So I really worry about this, Fatima. If And I use this as a ridiculous example because I think that it's ridiculous. If we say that to get opportunities, you have to achieve, okay? Following me? You have to achieve first, and then you get opportunities. And this is our measurement of achievement. That's pathetic. And we should be worried about the false positives we get, but mostly about the false negatives we get. So if I have a student who gets the wrong answer on this one, but this kid is brilliant and gets passed over because they think slightly differently, I want to be terrified of that. I don't worry too much about the student who cheats the system and gets an A, is a plotter, maybe does something that I don't think is very creative. I worry about the student who doesn't score the score because of the way that we've designed the assessment. Those are the people that I am terrified to lose and to leave behind because of the assessments we've done. So I think the whole thing's broken, to be honest. And I think that we've done this for reasons of economics and a notion of fairness, but we know it's not fair. We know it's not equitable, but we try to do the same thing for everyone and make it completely equal and equivalent. And we think that that is the best that we can do to make it fair. I think we need to really challenge ourselves on notions of fairness. So Fatima, I think that you should never be judged on something like this. Opportunities should never be doled out because of answers to things like this. I think we got to change.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. Reading through the chat here again. Just a bunch of comments kind of agreeing with what you're saying. And
Yeah, actually, I have like a comment on that. So I'm actually a student, and what I have noticed that students themselves don't want the ungrading, so to say, because like they need money or they need some scholarships, etc. So it's not really about the teachers are initiating or the system. It's even the students themselves. They do not want it actually this time because it's not. You cannot predict the future that way.
Right, but you can't predict the future with grades either. How many people with really high SAT scores fail out of their first year of university? We know it's crap. Gabriella, the issue is this. If they don't want the ungrading, they can still have a grade. They will still get a grade. Everything up until how they get that grade is our opportunity to design. So how do you want the student to achieve the grade? That's something you as an instructor will decide. And if those grades then have an impact on opportunities available to the student, then that's something we need to consider in the pipeline as well.
All right, thank you.
Push back if you think I'm wrong, please. I get impassioned about this, Gabriella. I don't mean to suggest that it's easy.
It's more like the problem is that, at least in my institution, it's mostly about the market. So it's like as if university is some kind of a market, and when the majority like gives what the system will be like. So for example, if 8 students do not want ungrading, then the teacher will, just leave things as they are, kind of thing. So if like 2 students want ungrading, but others don't, then the majority system wins. So it's a bit complicated in this case.
Well, so the majority, it gets complicated if you're saying the majority wins. Inclusion doesn't always get achieved when the majority wins. If you're part of a minority population, you're never going to win. So I think that that's part of a bigger conversation of why are we measuring winning? Why does it have to be one or the other? Can it be both? And I know that it comes down to time and how much time you can spend grading in these different ways, but why does it have to be one way? Why can't it be another? And this is something that I found with the ungrading. I was spending a lot more time building a relationship with the students and communicating with them with feedback. That took me more time. And Nick, to your point about being loose about deadlines, I said to them, look, I don't I don't care if you hand things in late. Like, do not fret about this. I had one student who was routinely handing things in late, and I didn't learn about this until the last reflection, where he told me he had crippling anxiety, and the reason he was handing it in the day after it was due is because he didn't want me to read any of his reflections out loud in class. He knew if he handed it in late, that I wouldn't be able to. So that was kind of amazing, because I would never have known that. He started handing them in a few days before the class because he got to the point where he wanted me to read them and wanted to be able to reflect on them. But for him to be able to feel that, know that, articulate that, and then change that, that was a pretty enormous learning moment for him. And that was a pretty enormous learning moment for me. I also had a student who at midterms wasn't pushing herself very much on her project, and I was a little hard on her. And then she stopped handing in reflections from there on out. At the last reflection she handed in, it just had a website, a URL. I went to the URL, and she had built a website around the whole class and all of her reflections. She'd been doing them all completely on time, time-stamped, but she told me in her last reflection that she was in a discipline that was male-dominated, and she had a really hard time, she realized, taking any kind of criticism from anybody. So she shut down. But what she did was brilliant. She found a way to still participate, to not worry about my gaze. That's the whole goal of this. She still did all of the work. She did it without me. We had this amazing back and forth conversation, and I think she's changed forever. I'm changed forever. I think that that's to me the reason to do this stuff, because of the people that are those false negatives that we're leaving behind. She didn't hand a damn thing in, and I thought, she's just checked out. I've lost her. She'd done more. It was amazing. Fatima, I have a feeling you're here because you're going to tell me I've been talking too long.
No, it's been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. I honestly really enjoyed it, hearing your stories and hearing everyone else's opinions. I think it's really amazing. So thank you so much.
Thanks for the opportunity.